Ina, thank you.
Great to see you.
Do I get to make some joke about blowing in the wind after the Bob Dylan connection here? I don't know.
The floor is yours. So you and I most recently saw each other in Paris at the AI Action Summit. And I feel like what Paris really encapsulated is this, there's been a real huge shift in the policy world. The technology is changing all the time, but the policy world actually really shifted. And I think it's an opportunity to really look at what should it be. And obviously, I knew you'd have a lot to say even a couple weeks ago, but you kind of just put it all on paper. Yeah. Before we get into the specifics of what OpenAI recommended, all these companies and different interested folks, the White House put out a call, basically asking, what should our policy around AI be? And OpenAI commented, Meta, a lot of artists, a lot of different voices came in. But first I want to talk a little bit just about that shift in conversations. There were summits in Bletchley Park and Seoul that were very much focused on how do we make this technology safe? And all of a sudden it feels like we're not talking about that at all. And obviously, as a business, I'm sure OpenAI is like, we got this, we can do the safety thing, but not everyone's necessarily going to behave the same way you are. A couple years ago, you spent a lot of time in DC. OpenAI was here all the time. There were all these meetings saying, we need to make this technology safer. We need regulation. Do we still need regulation?
Well, I think there has been, you're hitting on this, and I think it's too cliche to call it like a quote unquote vibe shift. I think there's something a little bit deeper going on, which is, this technology really, people have been working on it for decades, but effectively exploded on the scene in November of 2022 when
something happened then, right?
Chat emerged, right? And I think if you go back to 2022 until maybe take the Paris event, I think the companies, I think policymakers, I think the public, I think opinion elites all became a lot more familiar with the technology. And I think what people are beginning to really appreciate and recognize is that, yes, we need to make sure we're building this in a way that people are confident in. But I do think that the companies who are building this, particularly at the large scale, have really demonstrated that over the last several years. Not perfect, but generally have shown that they're building this in responsible ways. And the larger opportunity that exists out there, we'll get to it, but we believe that you could see GDP growth 18 to 20% in a decade from the productivity gains that you will get from this, and that the prosperity opportunity and progress opportunity that represents. And so I think what you saw in Paris, I think what you're seeing here in Washington, and frankly in states around the country, is the understanding that there is a huge economic growth opportunity. And can we get that right? Because if we get that right, that unlocks an awful lot of things.
And even if we accept all that just at face value, it seems to me that there's not a guarantee. There's all the specifics that Senator Klobuchar was just going into, but we don't have federal legislation over most of this. And you're saying, yes, a lot of the companies, people have more confidence. Let's take that at face value and assume people are more confident in the companies. I'm not sure that's true, but let's take it for a moment. You have companies like Meta that are putting their tools out into the world for anyone to use. How does safety happen in a world that has tremendous OpenAI technologies that anyone can use absent legislation?
Well, I think maybe reverse a little bit, which is there are a lot of laws that already do apply. I think that's one of the things that people have become more aware of and cognizant of, that we do live in a legal law-based society. There is a lot of legislation out there. There are a lot of regulations that already just basically apply to how people, companies, products are introduced into the world. Again, I think that there was a growing understanding and recognition of that. And then also, I think, a growing recognition and understanding that we do need to make sure that we are leading as a country on the innovation, and how you think about that from a US competitiveness perspective. So I think that is now infusing a lot of the conversation. And there's really two prongs there, right? One is, how do we ensure that this is US-led so that the US benefits from the economic prosperity? And then the question of who participates in that, I think a very real and important question and part of the conversation that does need to take place. And then secondly, that we are in a real race and a real competition with the communist-led People's Republic of China, and that is a game that is very much on. Earlier speakers talked about the capabilities coming out of China. We can have a discussion about how and where they got those from, but at the end of the day, they have very, very, very impressive capabilities. And the competition between those two entities and whoever ends up prevailing on that is going to have a huge impact on what our world looks like. And so when you start to talk about regulations and how we think about this, I think it's a little bit of what altitude are you taking that at, and what are you really looking to solve for from an output perspective?
And I do want to get more specific. I purposely started out with regulation
Sure.
broadly, but obviously, even when you guys were calling for regulation, you always wanted certain types of regulation in certain areas, and we're not in favor of broad regulations that would prevent you from competing with China. It was already clear it was going to be a race with China in the last administration.
That's right. And I think another aspect of this that I think that has evolved, just to push on this a little bit, is people beginning to understand that there are also different players in this. Right? There's the big frontier models, of which something like an OpenAI is. Then there's the developers and who are building stuff. Then there's the users, and within all of that. And you and I were talking backstage about historical analogies and which ones you want to pick from. But whenever we've gone through big transitions, having to think where you're allocating the responsibility, because there's different actors on this. And my favorite historical analogy for this, or my two favorite, is this is like electricity, or this is like the transistor. Those were usually transformative, but where responsibility fell was different. And even different within those stacks.
So where, broadly speaking, one of the big debates is, do we regulate frontier models? Do we regulate the use case? Europe went more heavily over one. It seems to me like the US hasn't done either. I generally don't give out my magic wand, especially this early.
Oh, you're coming early.
I'm coming early with the magic wand. What is one piece of significant legislation that OpenAI that you would like to see?
So we have endorsed any number of pieces of legislation, including you had Senator Klobuchar up here just beforehand. And there are various bills in Congress dealing with...
But what would make us safer?
So I'll answer that question really specifically. I think what most people in this country want when it comes to AI is not necessarily dealing with the stuff that folks maybe in this room are talking about and that you're getting at. It is like the basic things. How are we thinking about protecting kids? We've done a ton and have supported a ton on CSAM and putting children's protections in place. How do we think about deep fakes and building things in like effectively watermarks, C2PA standards? Like those are, and then deep fake legislation, particularly if it's impacting elections. Those are all things that we have come out and supported and endorsed. And I do think those are the areas that normal everyday people actually are concerned about on this. And they're equally concerned in making sure that they have the chance to participate in the opportunity.
And then there's a couple specifics that you called for in OpenAI in its policy recommendations, and they're pretty similar to others in the industry. One of the most controversial is the idea that you should be able to train AI systems on copyrighted material. Right now, that's a battle that's playing out in the court. Your company and others are saying, we think that's fair use. A lot of publishers and creative types are saying they don't. My sense, reading between the lines from what you and others said, is we like our position in court. What we'd really like is for us to explicitly have that right. Has OpenAI trained any models only on licensed data?
So we use data that's appropriately accessible and available, right? We've been
I understand what you use
right?
in the models you have. Have you separately done any work to create one that's only material you've licensed?
Well, you're asking the question then of what your legal definition of fair use is. So let's talk a little bit about that. So first of all, I think, and I'm pretty confident in this, that we, OpenAI, have done more partnerships with more media entities than anyone else.
Full disclosure,
Axios.
including Axios. We have a deal with OpenAI.
Yes, and we'll be doing a really interesting initiative in a couple different states with you all, but also a bunch of other publishers. Point one. Point two is fair use is in our Constitution. It is one of the differentiators that has always existed here in the United States, where when we created the Constitution, there was a belief that we needed to think about copyright and fair use in the context of how do you allow technological innovation to benefit the broader good of the country. We took a very different approach.
No, I understand that.
Than European countries.
You're going to make that in court. You're going to make that argument in court, but you're also asking, correct me if I'm wrong, you would like either the executive or legislative branch to clarify that AI is included.
What we asked for is that fair use be applied in the same way that in the mid-90s, when I had a lot more hair and was working on the Telco Act, working in the Clinton administration here, right, we made the argument that as technology evolved, and as it has done historically in this country, you continue to make sure that fair use evolves to match where that technology is going.
But if you're signing all these licensing deals, which you are, including with us, why not build on top of what you've licensed and what's truly in the public domain? Not publicly accessible, but what's truly in the public domain. Why not build an engine and see what you can do with the technology?
Because I think but that's what we are currently doing, right? We currently use what is
you're
publicly accessible. That is your,
but plenty of it's copyright.
You're making your particular part, right? We believe that the law is on our side, and that there's a lot of other folks who are on our side.
So if the law is on your side, why cut the content?
And so what we argued for in the RFI is that you continue to apply fair use consistent with the way that the technology is evolving, right? And the analogy that we have used is that, in the United States, we created something called libraries. People were able to go into those libraries, they were able to take the books, they were able to read those books, and they were able to democratize knowledge that way. Now, they were not allowed to go into those libraries, take the book, remove the cover, put their own cover on, put their name on it, and sell it, right? What they
Some
were
would
able
argue
to do,
that's what you and Meta are doing. We don't have time to get into all the...
well, let me reverse. Is that what Axios is suggesting in our partnership?
Well, that was going to be my next question.
So is that what we're doing with your partnership?
Well, I didn't, to be clear, I had no part in those discussions and was not privy to it. What I will say is, if you're signing all these, if you believe everything you do is fair use, why even sign these content deals? Because you're paying money for content, but then you're using a much wider swath of content to train the engine. If you're so confident in the position, we appreciate the checks, I'm sure, but why?
I was going to say, you're going to send me the check back? No, I'll answer the question. So I think there is a distinction between what you're asking about, right? There is the ability to apply fair use so that you can get data and information that is out there and publicly accessible and publicly available. There's quite another thing when you're going to do a specific partnership to actually get entire pieces of content that is sourced to that particular entity. Sometimes revenue will go back based on that. Obviously, that's how some versions of search have worked. I think the way we do it really allows it to get attributed and go back to the publication. So you're talking with apples and oranges here, and so I think we do need to be clear about what type of data and what type of information you're talking about, because those are two totally different categories and classifications.
Well, I would love to debate copyright and fair use for the rest of the afternoon, but I want to get to three other things before I let you go.
But there's one last point here, which you haven't asked about on this, and this is, I do think, what we said in that submission. And what I do think is different on the quote-unquote fair use and data issue, which is, historically in the country, the conversation was about fair use and how it would allow information to benefit the common good by contributing to innovation in this country. And that has allowed the US to become the technological center of the world. What is perhaps different this time around is it's also now a national security issue, right? So we are competing with China. Let's just be clear.
Okay.
Right? We are competing with China, right? Those Chinese entities get access to all the data here. Period. They're not concerned.
They
about,
also get access to every movement of their citizens.
Yeah, but let me finish.
Should we install cameras?
They're not concerned about fair use one way or the other on this. They're not distinguishing the different categories. They're getting all of this information. They also have an infinite amount of information they can get on their own. Right? The U.S. is competing with China. Whoever ends up winning on that ends up building the AI rails for the world. Like, that is a bit of a zero-sum game. And do you want the world built on autocratic, let me finish, autocratic, authoritarian AI, where there's not going to be any copyright, there's not going to be any fair use, you're not going to have any freedoms? Or do you want those rails built on US-led, small d democratic, free and open and accessible AI rails? And that is very much of the conversation, because to build AI, you need chips, you need energy, and you need data. Those are the fundamental building blocks for the technology that's going to determine what our world's going to look like going forward.
So I'm going to have to skip preemption and export controls. For all of you who are big fans of preemption and export controls, I apologize.
People have been waiting all day for a conversation on preemption here.
Come find us. We'll be doing that. I did want to, before I let you go, ask one question. You are in there's a lot of things that are unique about this moment of time. One is, there's probably a handful of companies in your space. One of the smaller ones is this company, XAI, run by Elon Musk. He's both suing OpenAI, he's running XAI, and he's also seems to be pretty involved in this city. How do you, as a policy guy, manage that, where one of your big rivals, somebody who's in a heated legal debate, is also, let's just say, very involved in the current administration? I don't know how you describe his role.
Yeah, I'll let you describe the role. You probably do a better job than I would. Look, I think the way we look at it, and it's consistent with a bit of this conversation, is that OpenAI plays an incredibly important and critical role in ensuring that the U.S. is going to be leading on AI. We have had really great opportunities to engage with the administration at every level. On President Trump's first full day in office, we were in the West Wing announcing Stargate, which is a big $500 billion infrastructure project to help revitalize industrialization in this country, but also ensure that we have access to that compute that we've talked about. And so everything that we have seen and our experience thus far has certainly been that folks do recognize that for the U.S. to prevail in this competition, for the U.S. to make sure that AI is accessible to everyone in this country, that OpenAI has to be in the middle of that conversation. I mean, we are leading on the innovation here, and as such play a really critical role for the broader interests of the U.S.
Well, I would love to keep continuing the conversation. I have a feeling Chris and I are going to be debating fair use in the cocktail reception later.
I'm shocked that a reporter is interested in fair use, by the way.
Thank you so much, Chris.